Nadia Volkov had grown up as the reliable one in a family that had never quite known what to do with her younger sister's particular brand of chaos. Kristen was 3 years younger, magnetic in the specific way that certain people simply are without seeming to try, prone to dramatic entrances and exits in every relationship she'd ever had, and had spent most of her 20s cycling through a series of jobs, boyfriends, and minor personal crises that their mother, Galina, had absorbed with an endless, exhausted patience she never quite extended to Nadia's own, considerably calmer needs. Nadia had understood from an early age that her role in the family was to be the daughter who didn't require managing, the one who got good grades and paid her bills on time and never called home in tears at 11 at night, and she'd built her entire adult identity, to some degree, around the quiet satisfaction of being someone her family could simply rely on rather than worry about. She'd met Ethan Price at 26, at a mutual friend's dinner party, and had fallen for him with the specific, grounded certainty of someone who'd spent years watching her sister's chaotic relationships and had decided, consciously, that she wanted something different for herself, steady, kind, uncomplicated in the best possible sense. Ethan worked as a civil engineer, methodical and patient in exactly the ways Nadia found comforting rather than boring, and their relationship had progressed with an ease that felt, at the time, like simple good fortune rather than anything requiring particular vigilance or doubt. They married 3 years after meeting, in a small ceremony that Galina had cried through, and had spent the following 4 years building the kind of quiet, satisfying life together that Nadia had always imagined for herself, a house in a good school district they didn't yet need, careers that were both advancing steadily, a marriage that felt, by any measure Nadia could apply to it, fundamentally solid. Kristen's relationship with Ethan, over those 4 years, had remained cordial but never especially close, the particular distance of two people who existed in each other's lives primarily through the connective tissue of Nadia herself rather than any independent affection. Kristen had gone through a difficult stretch in the 2 years before the accusation, a job loss, a breakup with a boyfriend named Marcus that had ended badly enough that Kristen had needed to move back in with their parents for several months, a general sense of her life stalling out while watching her older sister's steady, comfortable success unfold in painful contrast. Nadia had tried, during this period, to be supportive in the ways she knew how, offering money when Kristen needed it, listening to her complaints about Marcus during long phone calls that sometimes stretched past midnight, inviting her to dinners with Ethan that Kristen usually accepted with a kind of brittle, performed gratitude that Nadia had chalked up, at the time, to simple depression rather than anything more calculating. What Nadia hadn't fully registered, in those years leading up to the accusation, was the specific quality of resentment that had been building in her sister. Not the ordinary, manageable envy that exists between siblings with different life trajectories, but something sharper and more corrosive, fed by years of watching their mother's attention and pride flow more easily toward Nadia's steady accomplishments than toward Kristen's chaotic, unfinished attempts at building a comparable life. Kristen had said things, occasionally during their late-night phone calls, that Nadia had registered as simply the ordinary venting of someone going through a hard time, comments about how everything just works out for you, about how mom's always been easier on you, about how unfair it felt that Nadia had gotten the good husband, while Kristen kept ending up with men who left her. Nadia had responded to these comments with sympathy rather than alarm, never imagining they represented anything beyond the ordinary emotional turbulence of a sister going through a difficult few years. The phone call came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October, while Nadia was at her desk finishing a project report, and she remembered, even years later, the specific quality of dread in Kristen's voice from the very first words, a shakiness that read, in the moment, as genuine and devastating rather than performed. "I need to tell you something," Kristen had said, "and I need you to not hate me." What followed had unfolded with a specificity that made it feel, at the time, impossible to doubt. A work conference 8 months earlier that Kristen claimed to have attended as a favor for a friend who worked in the same industry as Ethan, a chance encounter at the hotel bar, several drinks, a single, drunken mistake that Kristen described through genuine-sounding tears as the worst decision of her life. One she'd been carrying alone for months out of shame and fear of exactly this. Conversation. The due date Kristen described placed the conception within a specific 2-week window in February, a detail that landed with devastating, corroborating weight because Nadia remembered, with sudden and sickening clarity, that she herself had been in Portland during exactly that window. Having flown out on short notice to help care for their father after an emergency hip replacement surgery that had required nearly 2 weeks of recovery, support neither of her parents could manage alone. Ethan had stayed behind, citing work obligations he genuinely had that made the trip difficult for him to join, a fact that had seemed, at the time, like simple practical logistics and now suddenly took on an entirely different, horrifying shape. Nadia had driven to Ethan's office that same afternoon, barely remembering the drive itself, and had confronted him in the parking lot as he was leaving for the day, watching his face shift through several stages of confusion before landing on something that looked, in the moment, exactly like the specific panic of a guilty man caught in an impossible position. He denied it immediately and completely, his voice rising with an intensity that Nadia, in her devastated, adrenaline-flooded state, had interpreted as overcompensation rather than genuine outrage. "Nadia, I have never touched your sister. I don't know what she's told you, but I swear to you, this never happened." She hadn't been able to hear any of it clearly through the roaring in her own ears, the specific, catastrophic collapse of trust that made every word out of his mouth sound, to her in that moment, like exactly what a liar would say. The weeks that followed unfolded with a speed that surprised even people close to the situation. Nadia moved out within 7 days, unable to remain in the house they'd shared, staying first with a friend and then in a small apartment she found within the month, moving through the practical logistics of separating a shared life with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else, even as the emotional core of her had gone numb and disoriented. Ethan called repeatedly during this period, sent long, detailed messages asking her to actually examine the timeline, to demand real evidence from Kristen rather than accepting a tearful account at face value, to consider a paternity test once the baby was born that would settle the question definitively one way or the other. Nadia, blindsided and humiliated in front of a family she'd need to keep facing at every holiday and gathering for the rest of her life, wasn't in any state to conduct the kind of careful, patient investigation Ethan was asking for. Every plea he made felt, in her devastated state, like exactly the kind of desperate maneuvering a guilty man would attempt, and she filed for divorce 4 months after Kristen's initial phone call, moving through the process with a grim, determined efficiency that left little room for doubt to creep back in. The divorce finalized 8 months after Kristen's phone call, and Nadia spent the following 2 years building a new life with the same methodical determination she brought to everything, throwing herself into her work, moving to a different apartment across town, slowly rebuilding a social circle that didn't include Ethan or the specific, painful memories attached to their shared history. She dated occasionally during this period, nothing serious, and told herself, with varying degrees of conviction depending on the day, that she'd made the right decision, that no marriage could survive a betrayal like the one Kristen had described, that she was better off having discovered Ethan's true character before investing even more years in a relationship built on a foundation she now believed had always been unstable. Kristen's miscarriage had come roughly 3 months after the initial announcement, delivered to the family with appropriately somber phone calls and a grief that read, at the time, as entirely genuine. Kristen describing cramping and bleeding late one evening, an emergency room visit, a doctor's grim confirmation that the pregnancy had ended. The family had rallied around her with casseroles and sympathy cards and careful, gentle check-ins, treating the loss with the same solemnity they'd have extended to any genuine miscarriage, and Nadia, despite everything, had found herself, in odd, unguarded moments, feeling a strange flicker of grief herself for a baby that would have been her nephew or niece regardless of the circumstances of its conception. She'd sent Kristen a card. She'd called to check on her, briefly, their conversation strained but not entirely severed, the specific, complicated bond of sisterhood proving more durable than either of them had probably expected given everything that had happened between them. Galina had never fully recovered her equilibrium after the divorce, caught in the impossible position of a mother watching 2 daughters she loved locked in a conflict she couldn't easily navigate without appearing to take sides. She'd maintained careful, diplomatic relationships with both Nadia and Kristen throughout the 2 years that followed, hosting separate holiday gatherings when necessary to avoid forcing the sisters into the same room before either of them was ready, offering vague, non-committal responses whenever either daughter tried to draw her into discussing the specifics of what had happened. Nadia had noticed, during this period, a particular strain in her mother's demeanor that she'd attributed, at the time, to the ordinary stress of managing a fractured family, never suspecting that Galina was carrying something considerably heavier than diplomatic exhaustion. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis came in early spring, nearly 2 years after the divorce, delivered with the specific, devastating speed that particular disease was known for. Galina had been experiencing vague digestive symptoms for several months that her doctor had initially attributed to less serious causes, and by the time imaging revealed the actual problem, the cancer had already progressed to a stage that made aggressive treatment largely a matter of extending time rather than achieving a cure. Nadia had flown home immediately upon hearing the diagnosis and spent much of the following 8 months traveling back and forth between her own life and her parents' house, watching her mother decline with the specific, unbearable slowness that terminal illness sometimes allows, granting enough time for both dread and a strange, complicated kind of peace to develop in its shadow. Galina spent much of her final months in the particular, reflective state that people facing death sometimes enter, revisiting old memories, making calls to friends she hadn't spoken to in years, offering pieces of advice and expressions of love that felt, to Nadia, both precious and almost unbearably poignant given how limited the remaining time had become. It was during one of the better weeks in this final stretch, a period when the medication was managing her pain effectively enough that she remained mostly lucid and alert, that Galina asked Nadia's aunt, her younger sister Oksana, to bring her a pen and several sheets of stationery, and spent the better part of an afternoon, alone in her bedroom with the door closed, writing something she sealed carefully into an envelope and gave to Oksana with specific, deliberate instructions. "Don't give this to Nadia until after the funeral," Galina said, according to what Oksana would later tell Nadia. "Not before. After. I need her to have already buried me before she reads it, because once she reads it, I don't think she'll be able to look at me the same way, and I would rather that happen after I'm already gone than while I'm still here to see it in her face." Oksana hadn't asked what the letter contained, understanding, with the particular respect people sometimes extend to the dying, that Galina's request deserved to be honored without interrogation. She'd simply taken the envelope, tucked it away in a drawer at her own house, and waited through the remaining weeks of her sister's decline, through the funeral itself, through the exhausting, grief-heavy days that followed, before finally, 3 days after they'd buried Galina, calling Nadia and telling her, carefully, that there was something her mother had left for her. Nadia read the letter alone in her apartment on a Thursday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her, unaware of what she was about to encounter until the specific, devastating first sentence rearranged everything she'd believed for the past 2 years. "I have known for 2 years that Kristen was never pregnant, and I let you divorce a good man, because I was afraid of what telling you the truth would do to this family. I have to tell you now, because I cannot die carrying this the way I've carried it for 2 years, watching you rebuild a life around a lie I helped protect through my silence." Nadia read the sentence 3 times before she could make herself continue, her hands beginning to shake in a way that made the paper tremble audibly against the table surface. The letter continued, Galina's handwriting growing slightly less steady in places where, Nadia would later understand, the effort of writing while dying had clearly taken its physical toll. "Kristen came to me 4 months after she told you about the pregnancy, before the miscarriage, crying, telling me the truth, that there had never been a baby, that she'd made the entire thing up out of jealousy she'd been carrying for years, watching you build the life she felt she couldn't build for herself. She told me she'd panicked once the lie started spreading and didn't know how to take it back without destroying herself in the process, and she begged me not to tell you, said it would ruin her life, said she'd find some way to end the fake pregnancy quietly and let everyone believe it had simply been lost. I told her this was wrong. I told her she needed to tell you the truth herself. And then I let her convince me to stay silent instead, because I was afraid of losing my relationship with her, afraid of the family fracturing completely if the truth came out in the wrong way, afraid, if I am honest, of my own cowardice being exposed alongside hers. I have hated myself every single day for 2 years, watching you rebuild a life you shouldn't have had to rebuild, watching you carry a grief and a distrust of men that Ethan never actually earned. I don't know if you can ever forgive me. I don't know if there's any version of this letter that doesn't destroy your relationship with your sister and possibly your relationship with me, even now that I'm gone. But I could not let myself die without telling you the truth, because the alternative, dying with this secret still intact, letting you go the rest of your life believing a lie I helped protect, was something I found I simply could not do, no matter how much easier it might have been. I am so sorry, Nadia. I am sorry for my silence, and I am sorry for what that silence cost you. Please know that whatever anger you feel toward me now, it does not come close to matching what I have felt toward myself every day since Kristen told me the truth. Nadia sat at her kitchen table for nearly an hour after finishing the letter, unable to move, the specific, catastrophic weight of what she'd just learned settling into her chest in waves that seemed to arrive from different directions simultaneously. Grief for the marriage she destroyed based on a lie, fury at her sister for constructing that lie with such devastating specificity, a complicated, painful anger at her mother that existed alongside genuine grief for a woman she'd just buried days earlier, and underneath all of it a slow, dawning horror at the 2 years Ethan had spent being blamed for something he'd never done, watching his own marriage dissolve based on an accusation his wife hadn't been willing to properly investigate before believing. She called Kristen that same night, her hands still shaking as she dialed, and when her sister answered, Nadia didn't bother with any preamble. "I have Mom's letter," she said. "I know everything." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Nadia almost hung up before Kristen finally spoke, her voice small and strange, stripped of the performed distress that had once made her fake pregnancy so devastatingly convincing. "I've wanted to tell you for so long," Kristen said. "I just didn't know how after everything, after how much time had passed. I'm so sorry, Nadia. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I'd forgive me either." Nadia didn't have a response for that, not yet, the specific work of processing 2 years of manufactured grief and misplaced blame still only beginning. She hung up without saying much else, sat with her mother's letter for a long time afterward, and then, several days later, once she'd found some fragile equilibrium, did the thing she'd spent 2 years believing she'd never have reason to do again. She called Ethan. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the particular, careful neutrality of someone unsure what kind of conversation was about to unfold. "Nadia," he said, "is everything okay?" "I need to tell you something," she said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the exact words Kristen had once used to destroy their marriage. "And I need you to know that I believe you now, completely, and that I am more sorry than I know how to say."